Hello, this is Hida, and I'm here today to talk about how your CMS could be seen as an accessibility assistant and how that can help organizations, including maybe the clients or the users of a CMS. Very briefly about myself, I work as an accessibility specialist at the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, where I work at the Web Accessibility Initiative. We have a website which I'd like to plug. On our website there's loads of information about web accessibility, about planning, designing, developing, testing, advocating and training for web accessibility. Many people don't know about all these amazing resources that are on this website, so I thought I'd mention it. But disclaimer, I do work on some of the content for this site. Now, I focus mostly in my work on authoring tools. And authoring tools, if you're not familiar with that phrase, they are tools that create web content. And with that, as probably won't surprise you, they are also tools that can improve a lot of web accessibility at once. That is a very exciting prospect, I think, and I'll be talking a lot today about how we can make that a reality. How can we really employ authoring tools to improve accessibility in many places at once. Now first, let's look at a couple of examples of authoring tools. We're talking about things like WYSIWYG editors, course creators, learning management systems, or anything that they use in online education, very important in times of COVID. Content management systems, of course, Wikipedia, your Save as HTML functionality, social media, form generators, site builders. Lots of these different things all have in common that they create content for the web, or that they provide some sort of interface for their users to create something that will ultimately live on the web. Now, specifically about CMSs, as we're at WordPress Accessibility Day, you can think of the authoring tool as the CMS itself, and I imagine some people watching this today work on WordPress core, or have provided some patches for it, or maybe considering contributing to WordPress. But others may be working on plugins like form builders, custom field managing stuff, things where you can manage events or social media, cookie banners even, just anything that you can plug into a website and that will also create web content. It will also be considered as an authoring tool. And when I talk about CMSs in this talk, I very much also mean plugins and themes as well. Now, the web is meant to work for everyone. That is a point that we take very seriously at the W3C. This is a photograph of Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, who was at the opening ceremony of the London Olympics in 2012. And he made these 4 words appear: "This is for everyone." Now, I think, and I haven't checked this with him personally, but I think you could interpret this in various ways. One is that the web should be available for everyone to kind of get onto the web. So, of course, you need to get a cable subscription or go to a library and maybe pay to use a computer. But ultimately, the web is available for everyone. This is for everyone. Secondly, I think everyone can have a website on the web as well. You don't need to apply for a permit at your local government or something like that, or do something very special. You need to have a web server or rent one. You can put some HTML on there and make it available on the URL. So in that sense, it's also for everyone. And the third way that you could read this is for everyone, is as this is something that should work for everyone, including people with disabilities. And that is the definition that we use at Way. Making the web work for people with disabilities is what web accessibility is about. We want to make sure that this is for everyone. Now, to that extent, at Way we have 3 web standards that are about the accessibility of web content ultimately. Now, many people will be familiar with the WCAG standard, which stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But there's 2 more sets of guidelines that are very closely related and that together really create that picture of an accessible web. So there is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines about web content itself. But what about the software that people use to access web content? Browsers or user agents. There's a specific standard for that, the User Agent Accessibility Guidelines, UAG. And what about the software that creates web content, authoring tools? And for that, we have the authoring tools accessibility guidelines. So together, these 3 standards, they all say something about the accessibility of web content, about the content itself, about the software we use to view the content, and about the software we use to create the content. Now, authoring tools are very important, and CMS is with that. They're essential in this picture of web accessibility, because if we get it right in authoring tools, we'll be able to include more content creators. We can have more people publish stuff on the web. And the second reason that I think authoring tools are so important and exciting is that content creators may be allowed to fix accessibility problems before their website goes live. It is the central theme of what I want to say today. Now, the standard for authoring tools, as I said, is ATAG, with the latest iteration, ATAG 2.0. Now, in ATAG, and I'll talk about a lot of ATAG today, but if you want to read it at your own pace, you can visit this source called ATAG at a Glance. It's a page that has a bulleted list of the main points that are in the ATAG standard. So that is something you could review at your own pace, but today we'll also go through a bunch of different guidelines that are in ATAG, success criteria, and I hope to give you a good overview of what you can find in ATAG and how it can really help end users and people who edit content on the web. Now, the ATAG standard consists of 2 parts. The first part is about the editing experience, so the content editing itself, the backend, so to say. And the second part is about the output of content. I'll focus mostly on output today, but I'll also talk a bit about what we can do to improve the editing experience for people with disabilities. Yeah, let's look at that first. So part A of ATAG is about the accessibility of the editing experience. So the very first success criterion, A111, is about making sure that your interface conforms to the WCAG standard. And part of that, of course, is making sure that your interface works with text zoom. It's something I heard a lot from users when I talk to them for my work, is when they zoom in the interface, it's not as easy for them to use the interface, or sometimes the interface becomes completely unusable. So testing with text zoom is one thing you can do. Text alternatives for icons. It's very common these days to have interfaces that consist of just icons. So if you work on a plugin or a theme or something that has an editing interface where icons are the main thing you click on, make sure that there are text alternatives for them so that there's an accessible name somewhere in the source code. Make it work with a keyboard is another great advice, and that includes things like visible focus so that you can see at all times where you are on the page before you interact with something, and that you can use all controls. So that includes all form fields, anchors, and buttons. Another recommendation in ATAG is about displaying previews accessibly, because most content management systems or authoring tools in general, plugins as well, will have some way to preview the content that you're working on. And this criterion is about making sure that that content is accessible as well. Or you can think of things like helping with spelling. Some people may have dyslexia and they're editing some content. You can help them a great deal by helping them correct their spelling. Now that's a bit about the first part of ATAG, improving the editing experience, but what I really promised to talk about today is how your CMS could be an accessibility assistant. And in that sense, support the production of accessible content, as the official name is for part B of ATAG. And for that, let's talk a bit about what accessible content is. It is things like that you have tables with headers, that you have forms with the appropriate labels, that you have hero images with plenty of contrast, that videos are captioned, that you can have multilingual content with the right language attributes, that everything is nested according to specification, that carousels can pause, and that you have sensible heading structure. So all of these things, they contribute to more accessible content. So for your end users, for the people using the website or the web content that you're creating, all of these things need to be in order. So if we want to have a good accessibility assistant, it should assist with all of these different things. And usually they could be different products, right? Because sometimes you might have a plugin specifically for creating tables or one specifically for creating forms. So they could be specialized products that focus on these specific tasks. And an accessibility assistant would of course help avoid inaccessible content. So it would avoid things like tables with no headers. It would avoid things like form fields that have no names, illegible text, captionless videos, multilingual content that doesn't have the right lang attributes, non-standard nesting, carousels that don't have a pause button, and headings for the wrong reasons. So a CMS that really helps you get your accessibility right will maybe warn you for these kinds of mistakes, or it will generate markup that doesn't have these problems, and provide templates that comes with the right stuff. So that's what this is all about. We want to avoid inaccessible content for our end users ultimately, and we want to help the people that are using our products, like our CMS or our plugin or our theme. We want to help them avoid inaccessible content so that they can ship a website that is accessible and find problems before they ship it, ideally. So a great CMS can really help content managers make their content more accessible. Think about things like when content is created, it is accessible, which is the success criterion 112, B112 in the ATAC standard. And that is about things like, you need to make sure that it's nested according to the standard. You want to make sure there's no empty links inside of this content. Sometimes to make content accessible, you need some more information. So maybe you need to prompt the user for required accessibility information, like a caption for a table, an alternative text for an image or for video. Those sorts of things you would need to prompt for if you know that could cause an accessibility problem, and you rely on the content editor to provide it information. You'll need to prompt for it. So captions for tables, alt text for images, and labels for form fields are just some examples of things that you could prompt for. Or when content is generated, maybe there could be automated accessibility checks. Or if it can only be checked manually, maybe the tool should suggest to the user to do a manual check. For instance, if it's about the heading structure of the page, or if it is about text alternatives, maybe they are centrally managed and you want the user to make sure that the text alternative makes sense for this specific use case. For instance, a photo of a speaker, but their name is also in the content, so maybe at that point you would want a 0, or you would want an empty alternative text rather than repeat the name of the speaker. So that sort of thing that requires a manual check, someone who knows the content and understands it to go through it. And as an authoring tool, as a CMS, you could actually provide the right instructions and help the user to figure out how to make their content accessible. 211 is about allowing to create accessible content. So not everyone realizes this, but there are a lot of authoring tools out there that don't provide or don't allow for entering accessible content. For instance, if you upload a video, if there's no caption, it isn't accessible. But if your video widget doesn't have a caption button, then the user cannot create an accessible video with your authoring tool. Or if there's no alternative text option. And some social media, for instance, only recently added the option to add alternative text. And there is a bunch of social media out there that still don't have that option available. So even if users want to create accessible content, they are not able to because there's no option for alternative text. So for image fields, that means there should be an alternative text field, and for video players, there should be an upload button for captions. And this is specifically important for those creating plugins that deal with video or images. Make sure that people can manage their alternative text so that they can create accessible content in the first place. Something else that ATAC recommends is to have accessible templates for the most common use cases, and to be able to filter for that. I know there is a filter available in the WordPress directory of different themes. So that is another important way that you can help content editors make the right decisions. And there's B251, which says that you should provide accessible UI components, or as the specification calls it, pre-authored content. So when you provide something like a carousel or tabs component, and users can add that into the page, make sure that they are accessible by default so that the content editor doesn't need to do anything. It just ships as an accessible component. So it makes a lot of sense to spend time on accessibility if you provide something like a carousel tool, because everyone who's going to use your plugin is going to have a more accessible website. So it's going to have a huge effect if you spend that extra time on accessibility for all of those end users specifically. Now here's some interpretation of B311, which is, why not warn users when they introduce a color contrast issue? Say you work at an agency and a designer has produced this beautiful header with a dark photo of a black cat with white text on top of it. It has perfect contrast and it's been checked according to the accessibility guidelines. This is good, it passes all the tests. But then someone decides to replace the photo with one of Korean food in this case, and it is a perfectly valid photo, but it is very light and the text is also light. So at this point, when we drop in this photo, we've introduced a color contrast issue. Now it's possible to programmatically detect color contrast problems, and with that you could provide a warning for the content author that something is going wrong here. You could say, well, there's not enough contrast. Maybe there should be background color painted behind this text to fix the problem. Or in some cases, a larger text or a bolder font could be just enough to address the problem. Something else that you could do is to add a spell checker to content fields. I have a button here that says SWB mid, which I guess for visual sighted users, they might parse that in their head and see that it probably says submit because the W looks so much like a U. But if you are trying to use some assistive technology, it's going to be pretty tricky to use this button. And it's going to read it out weirdly in a screen reader. If you use something like naturally speaking, it's going to be hard to identify this specific button. So if there was a spell checker, you could avoid these accessibility problems altogether. Something else that you could automatically do is report readability levels. And I think I've seen this in some SEO plugins. But it's also a very valid thing to do for accessibility, to make sure that the text is nice and easy to read. You could have readability levels warn the user when they've added text that's too complicated and maybe help them fix the problems there as well. Something else that the standard recommends is to provide accessible examples. So if you work on documentation, you can do a great deal as well about accessibility of your CMS or plugin by making sure that all of the examples really help the user to get their accessibility right. Sometimes that means the stuff that maybe gets copy-pasted, really ensuring that everything there is perfectly accessible. Sometimes it means providing the right guidelines, like, if you leave this field empty, there won't be alternative text, so make sure you put something in there or explain kind of how alternative text works. So it's really putting in an extra mile and making sure that the example is accessible and really encourages good accessibility. So basically, a good CMS can encourage more accessible content and help people get their accessibility right. Now, I've talked about the standard quite a bit, but I think one of the exciting things about authoring tools that help with accessibility is that they can really help with your process. Let's look now at when in the process authoring tools can help. Now, process is a bit of a tricky subject, I think, because whoever you talk to, depending on their organization, they will have different ways of organizing their projects. Now, this is an example of a process that your organization might be following if it follows the waterfall principles. So you might start with some planning and strategy sessions, then do interaction design, then visual design, then development, then QA, then launch. You might have a process that is much more multidisciplinary. So you might have all the disciplines working together in iterations. That could be a thing in sprints or doing something like Scrum. Or you might be going back and forward between these phases, like going back from launch to strategy or to interaction design, or sometimes maybe from QA to design. Whatever you're doing, I think there is a lot to say about where authoring tools fit into the process. For instance, if you're working in planning and strategy, you can make a huge difference by choosing an authoring tool that supports accessibility in the ways that I outlined before. So adopting a lot of the principles in ATAC and really helping the user to get their accessibility right can really help in the long run, because if that's the case, then later on in the process, it will be much easier for the organization to create web pages that are accessible. In the interaction design phase, you could spend a great deal on how content should be authored in an accessible manner. You could test the authoring process with people with disabilities if user testing is part of your interaction design discipline. If you're doing visual design, you could provide guidelines for customizing color so that contrast works well. You could work on accessible examples like large enough touch targets. All these sorts of things can help you in the design phase to make sure that anyone who's authoring web pages later on, because you might not be designing every single web page, it might happen in the templating phase, and then content people might work with the designs that were created. So providing some guidelines there can really help in the authoring phase. When we're talking about development, you can make a great difference by picking a theme that has accessibility support or a plugin with accessibility support. Because, again, you'll help people who create web content to do that in a more accessible manner, or sometimes get a lot of accessibility for free if there's a carousel component or something that was built accessibly. When it comes to QA, you could embed automated accessibility tests in the authoring process. So, for instance, if someone creates a new page and presses save, that there are some tests that are running automatically. If you have some test automation engineers in your team, take advantage of them and let them help make the authoring process more valuable as well in terms of accessibility. And then when you launch, you may have something that is much more accessible than if you wouldn't have done all those things. Because many websites are launched without much regard for accessibility, sadly. That still happens. And those websites might find that they then hire accessibility consultants, get a big list of issues that they've never thought of, and it might take them a lot more time to work through all of those issues. So if you start very much in the planning phase and think about accessibility in all of these different phases, and I know that's not a new thing, but I just want to say that that really makes a big difference. And if you think of authoring in all of these phases, that can really help create much more accessible things by default. Now, it may be clear to you by now that at Way we find authoring tools a really important part of web accessibility, and to that extent, we're doing a number of things to improve the situation. The first thing is I just wanted to mention that if the ATAC standard itself is a bit of a long read, there is also the Implementing ATAC 2.0 document that has rationale and intent for each of the success criteria and a bunch of different practical examples. And I've taken some of the examples in this presentation from there as well. It helps to understand ATAC a bit better if you get stuck in the main ATAC document. Now, something that I'm involved with personally is something called the Way Guide project. Now, one thing that we're creating as part of that to help people use the authoring process that I just outlined, right? We're really putting authoring tools at the front and center to help you get your accessibility right. We want to help people find tools that support accessibility. So we created a list of authoring tools where you can filter by ATAC criteria and find tools that support accessibility. Now, this is all still dummy data that you can see here. It's not live yet. But we are working on getting our first entries into the list, and if you create a tool that you think qualifies for this, that has accessibility support and that meets one or more of the ATAC criteria, do get in touch. I'd be interested to hear from you. At the same time, we're also working on something called the ATAC report tool, where you can report on ATAC criteria. So you can fill in some details. Then you go to each of the guidelines and then you will say whether it passes or fails, and you can fill in some information about each of them. Now, this is kind of on an optional basis, so each of these are optional. You can fill in the ones that you want to showcase. So if you particularly deal with one of the criteria well, then you fill in those, maybe leave the others empty. Of course, we want to have as many criteria as possible. That will also make it easier for people to find your tool in our list. But yeah, we welcome reports this way as well. In this tool, you are able to create a report in JSON or HTML, and you can also publish that on your website to showcase how well you meet ATAC. And ultimately, you would be able to create a listing in the authoring tools list that we're working on. At the moment, there's not that connection yet because it's still in its early phases. But yeah, very much interested to hearing your feedback on this tool as well. Now, going to conclusions, what I wanted to share with you today is very much that CMSs are essential for an accessible web. it won't surprise you as people who work on CMSs and plugins and maybe themes even. But your work is very important for web accessibility. I hope this talk gave some more insights in more ways that it does. Now, secondly, I think CMSs should really help content editors get their accessibility right. And I hope in this talk I've outlined a number of ways in which they can. Hopefully we can really see our CMSs as accessibility assistants. And that's the question I want to leave you with. How would you turn your CMS, your plugin, your theme into a better assistant for web accessibility? For now, thanks very much for listening. You can find the slides on talks.hittethefreeze.nl. It's also going to have all the resources, links, and video, ultimately, I think. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. It's hitte@w3.org, or you can reach out on Twitter. Now, I'm going to be showing up in a live Q&A right after this. So with that, I want to just thank you for listening and shout out to the organizers of WordPress Accessibility Day. Thanks so much for putting this event on and inviting me to speak.